I'm Magnus History. Chernobyl, Ukraine. April 26, 1986. 1:23 a.m. Reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant has just exploded. A plume of radioactive smoke is rising 2 kilometers into the night sky. Firefighters are arriving on scene, not knowing they're being exposed to lethal doses of radiation with every breath. But the explosion isn't the worst part, because deep in the basement of the reactor building, water is pooling. And if that water reaches the molten nuclear fuel burning at over 2000 degrees Celsius, it will trigger a thermal explosion so massive it would make the initial blast look like a firecracker. Soviet scientists run the calculations. The explosion would be between 2 and 5 megatons. For context, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. This would be 300 times more powerful. It would vaporize Chernobyl instantly. The radiation would render Ukraine, Belarus, and a significant portion of Eastern Europe uninhabitable for centuries. Moscow, just 400 miles away, would need to be evacuated. We're talking about 50 million people displaced. The fallout would spread across the entire continent. Parts of Western Europe would become exclusion zones. The death toll would be incalculable. And they had roughly 1 week before it happened. The solution? Someone would need to dive into the flooded basement of an exploding nuclear reactor, navigate through pitch-black radioactive water, and manually open drainage valves to drain the pools. The problem? The radiation levels in that water were so high that whoever went down there would receive a lethal dose within minutes. Their life expectancy would be measured in days, maybe weeks if they were lucky. This was a suicide mission, and 3 men volunteered. Their names were Alexei Ananenko, Valeri Bezpalov, and Boris Baranov. And what they did in the next few hours would determine whether Europe had a future. This is their story. To understand why these 3 men had to make this impossible choice, we need to go back to the beginning. April 25th, 1986, the day before. Chernobyl nuclear power plant was one of the Soviet Union's pride and joy. 4 operational reactors generating massive amounts of electricity for Ukraine and beyond. It was considered safe, modern, and efficient. The reactors used a design called RBMK, a Soviet innovation that was cheaper to build than Western designs. But it had a fatal flaw that very few people knew about. Under certain conditions, it could become wildly unstable. On the night of April 25th, the operators of Reactor 4 were conducting a safety test. Ironically, they were testing what would happen if the reactor lost power. Could the turbines generate enough electricity while winding down to keep the cooling systems running until the backup generators kicked in? It was a legitimate question, and the test had been done before at other reactors. But that night, everything went wrong. The test required reducing the reactor's power output significantly, but due to a series of operator errors and design flaws, the power dropped too far, way below the safe operating level. The operators panicked. They needed to bring the power back up to continue the test, so they started removing control rods, the devices that absorb neutrons and keep the nuclear reaction under control. This was a mistake. They removed too many control rods. Way too many. The reactor became increasingly unstable. But the operators didn't realize how dangerous the situation had become because the reactor's instruments were giving them false readings. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26th, they pressed the emergency shutdown button. In a normal reactor, this would insert all the control rods at once and safely shut everything down. But due to a design flaw in the RBMK reactor, the emergency shutdown had the opposite effect. For a few critical seconds, it actually increased the nuclear reaction. The power output spiked to 33,000 megawatts. That's 10 times the normal operating level. The fuel rods began to melt, The water cooling them instantly turned to steam. The pressure inside the reactor vessel skyrocketed, and then reactor 4 exploded. The 2,000-ton concrete lid covering the reactor, called the upper biological shield, was blown completely off. It flipped in the air and landed back on the reactor at an angle, leaving the core partially exposed. A second explosion followed seconds later. This one was even more powerful. It destroyed the reactor building and sent burning graphite and nuclear fuel flying into the air. The radioactive plume rising from the exposed reactor core was releasing more radiation every hour than the Hiroshima bomb had released in total. Firefighters arrived within minutes. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Many of them would be dead within weeks from acute radiation syndrome. But they fought the fires anyway. Burning graphite was scattered across the roof. If the fire spread to reactor 3 next door, that reactor could explode too. The firefighters worked for hours. They put out the fires. They saved reactor 3, and they sacrificed themselves to do it. By morning, the immediate crisis seemed to be over. The fires were out, the reactor was still exposed and releasing massive amounts of radiation, but it wasn't actively exploding anymore. The Soviet government was already planning how to contain the disaster. They would eventually build a massive concrete and steel structure called the sarcophagus to entomb the reactor. But then the scientists discovered the water problem, and everything changed. April 27th, 1986, one day after the explosion. Soviet scientists and engineers were swarming the plant, trying to assess the damage and figure out what to do next. The situation was worse than anyone initially realized. The reactor core was completely destroyed. Tons of nuclear fuel, uranium dioxide mixed with melted graphite and steel, had turned into a molten radioactive lava. This substance, later nicknamed corium, was unbelievably hot. It was burning through everything it touched, slowly melting its way downward through the reactor building. And that's when someone asked the critical question, what's below the reactor? The answer was complicated. The reactor sat on a massive concrete pad. Below that were several levels of rooms and corridors. And below those, in the very bottom of the building, were large, water-filled pools. These pools weren't decorative. They were part of the reactor's safety systems. They were connected to pressurized water tanks that helped cool the reactor under normal circumstances. But now those pools were a doomsday device. Here's the problem. The molten nuclear fuel was burning downward at a rate of about 30 centimeters per day. The concrete was slowing it down, but it wasn't stopping it. Eventually, probably within a week, the corium would burn through all the floors and drop directly into the water pools below. What happens when you drop 2,000-degree molten nuclear material into water? A steam explosion. And not just any steam explosion. The scientists did the math. When the corium hit the water, it would instantly flash into steam. But this wasn't like a pot of water boiling over on your stove. We're talking about tons of molten radioactive lava hitting massive pools of water simultaneously. The resulting steam explosion would be thermonuclear in scale. Estimates range from 2 to 5 megatons of TNT equivalent. The entire Chernobyl plant would be vaporized. The 3 remaining reactors would be destroyed. All of their nuclear fuel would be released into the atmosphere. But worse, much worse, the explosion would create a crater so deep that it would breach the water table. Radioactive material would contaminate the Pripyat River, which flowed into the Dnieper River, which supplied water to Kiev, a city of 2.5 million people. And that was just the immediate area. The radioactive cloud from this explosion would render vast swaths of Europe uninhabitable. Millions would need to be evacuated. Millions more would be exposed to lethal radiation. The death toll could reach into the tens of millions over the following decades. This wasn't just a disaster. This was a potential extinction-level event for Europe. The Soviet government understood the stakes immediately. Premier Mikhail Gorbachev was being briefed hourly. The military was mobilized. But mobilizing the military doesn't help when the problem is tons of molten nuclear material burning through concrete. They needed to drain those water pools. Now, the problem was that the valves controlling the drainage were located in the basement of the reactor building, and that basement was now completely flooded with highly radioactive water. The water itself had been contaminated by radioactive particles falling from the destroyed reactor above. But even worse, the water was being continuously irradiated by the exposed reactor core just a few floors up. The radiation levels in that basement were measured at 10,000 roentgens per hour in some spots. For context, 500 roentgens over 5 hours is fatal. 400 roentgens can kill you if you're exposed for too long. These men would be swimming in water that could deliver a lethal dose in minutes. And it had to be done manually. There was no way to drain the pools remotely. The valves had been damaged in the explosion. Someone would need to physically locate them in the flooded basement and turn them by hand. The Soviet authorities made a decision. They put out a call for volunteers. They needed divers, or at least people who could swim, people who knew the plant layout, people who were willing to die. They were honest about what they were asking for. This was a suicide mission. There was no ambiguity about that. Whoever went down into that basement would receive a fatal dose of radiation, but if nobody went, millions would die. And that's when 3 men stepped forward. Alexei Ananenko was a senior engineer at Chernobyl. He was 35 years old, married, with children. He knew the plant better than almost anyone. He had worked there for years and understood the layout of the reactor building intimately. When the call went out for someone who knew where the valves were located, Alexei was the obvious choice, and he volunteered without hesitation. But he couldn't do it alone. The basement was a maze of corridors and rooms, many of them now underwater. It would be pitch black. The lighting systems were destroyed. Even with flashlights, visibility would be terrible. He needed someone with him, someone who also knew the plant, someone who could help navigate and operate the valves. Valeri Bezpalov was a plant engineer, also in his mid-30s. When he heard that Alexei had volunteered, he immediately volunteered to go with him. The 2 men knew each other well. They had worked together for years. If anyone could find those valves in the dark, flooded basement of a destroyed nuclear reactor, it was these 2. But there was one more problem. The basement was completely dark, and their flashlights would only do so much in the murky radioactive water. They needed someone on the surface to coordinate, someone to help guide them via radio, someone to operate the lights and equipment from a safer position. Boris Baranov stepped forward. He was a shift supervisor at the plant, 43 years old, older than the other 2, but experienced and calm under pressure. He volunteered to be their surface support. Now, some accounts suggest Boris's role was slightly less dangerous than the divers, because he would remain on a higher floor. But make no mistake, he was still going to receive a lethal dose of radiation. The entire reactor building was contaminated. Just being in there for the time this operation would take was a death sentence. All 3 men knew this. They were briefed on the mission by senior Soviet officials. The officials were frank. This mission would save millions of lives, but it would cost them their own. The men accepted these terms. There was no dramatic speech, no Hollywood moment. They were Soviet engineers doing their job under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. They were professionals. They understood what needed to be done. But that doesn't mean they weren't terrified. Alexei later recounted in interviews that he was absolutely scared. He had a family. He had children he wanted to see grow up. But he also understood that if he didn't do this, those children wouldn't have a future anyway. Valeri felt the same way. He wrote a letter to his family before the dive, just in case. He told them he loved them. He told them this was something he had to do. Boris spent time with his wife before the mission. He didn't tell her how dangerous it was. He didn't want her to worry, but he held her a little longer than usual, kissed her a little more tenderly. They all knew. On May 4th, 1986, to 8 days after the explosion, the mission was ready to begin. The three men suited up in what passed for protective gear: heavy rubber diving suits, respirators, dosimeters to measure their radiation exposure, though everyone knew the dosimeters would max out almost immediately. They were given powerful underwater flashlights. They were given diagrams of the basement layout, even though Alexei and Valeri had memorized it years ago. They were given a radio so Boris could communicate with them from the upper floor. And then they descended into the flooded reactor building. The water was dark. Not just dark, black. The kind of black where your flashlight beam seems to get swallowed up after a few feet. The kind of black where you can't tell which way is up. And it was cold. Surprisingly cold. You'd think water in a nuclear reactor building would be hot, maybe even boiling. But the cooling systems had been pumping water through these corridors for days. It was frigid. Alexei entered the water first. Then Valeri. The radiation counters they carried immediately went off the scale. The clicking from their dosimeters was so rapid it became a continuous scream. They ignored it and kept going. The basement of Reactor 4 was a labyrinth. Under normal circumstances, it was a complex network of corridors, rooms, and chambers housing various systems for the reactor. Pipes, valves, electrical equipment, coolant systems, all of it designed to keep the reactor running safely. But now it was a radioactive, underwater tomb. Alexei and Valeri waded into the water, which quickly became too deep to walk through. They began swimming, using their flashlights to navigate. The water was murky. Particulates of radioactive debris floated everywhere. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness but couldn't penetrate more than a few feet. It was like swimming through ink. Above them, on a relatively drier upper level, Boris Baranov was trying to provide additional lighting. He had brought powerful spotlights and was attempting to shine them down through openings in the floor. But it wasn't helping much. The water was too dark. The destruction was too complete. Boris's job was also to monitor their progress via radio and coordinate with the teams outside. He was the lifeline. If something went wrong, if the divers got lost, if they ran into trouble, he was their only connection to help. Not that help could do much in this situation. The two divers pushed forward. They knew roughly where the valves should be, but the explosion had changed everything. Corridors they remembered were collapsed. Rooms were unrecognizable. Equipment that should have been in one place was scattered or destroyed. And then there was the water itself. Swimming in radioactive water is a uniquely terrifying experience. You can't see the radiation. You can't feel it. But you know it's there. You know that every second you spend in this water, your cells are being destroyed. Your DNA is being shredded. Your body is accumulating damage that it can never repair. The dosimeters they carried were screaming. But they couldn't stop. Stopping meant death for millions. They swam deeper into the basement. Their mission was to find two specific valves, gate valve number 6 and gate valve number 7. These controlled the flow of water from the massive pressurized tanks into the pools below the reactor. If they could close these valves and open the drainage valves, the water would drain out of the pools. The corium would hit empty concrete instead of water. There would be no steam explosion. Europe would be saved. Simple in theory, nightmare in practice. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes, Alexei spotted something through the murky water, a large pipe. He recognized it. He signaled to Valeri. They were close. They followed the pipe through the darkness. Their breathing was labored. The respirators made it difficult to breathe normally. and the physical exertion of swimming through the flooded basement was taking its toll. But they couldn't slow down. Every minute in this water was a minute closer to death. Then Alexei's flashlight beam hit it, the valve wheel. It was large, about 1/2 meter in diameter, covered in a layer of radioactive sludge. But it was there. Alexei reached for it, grabbed it, tried to turn it. It wouldn't move. The valve had been submerged for over a week. The explosion had potentially damaged it, or maybe it was just seized from lack of use and the weight of the water pressure. Alexei pulled harder. Valeri swam over to help. Together, they grabbed the wheel and pulled with everything they had. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding, groaning sound that they could hear even underwater, the valve began to turn. Inch by inch, they cranked it open. The physical effort was enormous. They were fighting water pressure, fighting a damaged mechanism, fighting their own exhaustion and the growing realization of how much radiation they were absorbing. But they kept turning. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the valve was fully open. One down, one to go. They pushed forward through the water, looking for the second valve. Boris's voice crackled over the radio, asking for status updates. Alexei confirmed they'd opened the first valve. Boris relayed this to the teams outside. There was cautious optimism. If they could open the second valve, the drainage would begin. The crisis would be averted. But they still had to find it. The second valve was supposed to be in an adjacent chamber, but the layout was so destroyed that it was hard to be sure. They swam through another doorway, into another flooded room, and there it was, the second valve. This one was even harder to reach. It was positioned lower, requiring them to dive completely underwater to access it. They would have to hold their breath while turning it. Alexei dove first. He grabbed the wheel and pulled. Again, it was stuck. Valeri dove down to help. Together, underwater, in complete darkness, except for their flashlights, they cranked the second valve open. Their lungs were burning. The respirators only worked if you were above water. Down here, they were holding their breath like any other dive. But they kept turning. The valve opened. They surfaced, gasping. The valves were open. The drainage could begin. They radioed Boris. Mission accomplished. Now they just had to get out. Swimming back through the flooded basement was just as terrifying as swimming in. Alexei and Valeri were exhausted. The physical exertion, the fear, the radiation, it was all catching up to them. Their movements were slower. Their breathing was more labored. But they couldn't stop. Not yet. They retraced their path through the dark water, back through the corridors, back through the rooms. Boris guided them via radio, helping them navigate. When they finally emerged from the water, they were met by medical personnel and radiation safety officers. The officers checked their dosimeters. The readings were off the scale. Alexei and Valeri had received approximately 5,000 millisieverts of radiation. For context, the annual safe limit for nuclear workers is 50 millisieverts. These men had received 100 times that in less than an hour. They were immediately rushed to a decontamination station. They stripped off their contaminated suits. They showered in chemical solutions designed to wash away radioactive particles. But the damage was already done. The radiation they had absorbed was inside them, in their bones, in their organs, in every cell of their bodies. Boris Baranov, who had remained on the upper level, had also received a significant dose. Not as much as the divers, but still far more than any human should ever be exposed to. All three men were transferred to Hospital No. 6 Inches Moscow, the Soviet Union's premier facility for treating radiation exposure. It was the same hospital where the firefighters from the initial explosion were being treated. Many of those firefighters were already dead. The doctors at Hospital No. 6 were brutally honest with Alexei, Valeri, and Boris. They had received lethal doses of radiation. There was no cure. The best the doctors could do was manage the symptoms and make them as comfortable as possible. The men were told they had weeks to live, maybe months if they were lucky. They accepted this news with remarkable calm. They had known going in that this was a one-way mission. They had made their choice. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The men didn't die, at least not right away. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. They experienced symptoms of radiation sickness, nausea, fatigue, hair loss, damage to their bone marrow, but they didn't die. In fact, they started to recover. This shocked the doctors. Based on the radiation levels they'd been exposed to, these men should have been dead. Acute radiation syndrome is brutally efficient at killing people who receive doses this high. But somehow, Alexei, Valeri, and Boris survived. There are a few possible explanations. One is that their time in the water was shorter than initially estimated. Every minute counts with radiation exposure, and if they worked faster than expected, they might have absorbed less radiation than calculated. Another possibility is that the water itself provided some shielding. Water is actually an excellent radiation shield. While the water they were swimming in was contaminated, it may have blocked some of the gamma radiation coming from the exposed reactor core above them. A third possibility is simply individual variation in radiation resistance. Some people's bodies are better at repairing radiation damage than others. Maybe these three men just won the genetic lottery. Or maybe they were just incredibly lucky. Whatever the reason, they survived the initial crisis. They were eventually released from the hospital and allowed to return home. And here's where the myth and the reality of this story diverge significantly. For decades, the story of the Chernobyl suicide squad was told as a tale of ultimate sacrifice. 3 brave men who dove into radioactive water knowing they would die, and who did die shortly afterward. This story was repeated in documentaries, books, and articles. It became part of the Chernobyl legend. The 3 divers who gave their lives to save Europe. There's only one problem with that story. It's not entirely true. Yes, they volunteered for what everyone believed was a suicide mission. Yes, they were incredibly brave. Yes, they saved countless lives. But they didn't die right away. In fact, as of 2015, nearly 30 years after the dive, at least 2 of the 3 men were confirmed to still be alive. Alexei Ananenko and Valeri Bezpalov both survived well into the 2000s. They lived relatively normal lives, all things considered. They had careers, they had families, they grew old. Boris Baranov's fate is less clear. Some reports suggest he died in 2005 of a heart attack, which may or may not have been related to his radiation exposure. But he lived for nearly 20 years after the dive. This doesn't diminish what they did. If anything, it makes the story even more remarkable. They volunteered for a mission everyone believed was certain death. They did the mission successfully, and then they survived to see the results of their bravery. They saved Europe, and they lived to tell about it. So did the mission actually work? The answer is yes. Absolutely yes. Within hours of Alexei and Valeri opening those valves, the water in the basement pools began to drain. Slowly at first, then more rapidly as the drainage channels cleared. By May 6th, just 2 days after the dive, the pools were empty. And on May 8th, the molten corium burned through the concrete pad and dropped into the basement. If the water had still been there, the thermal explosion would have occurred exactly as the scientists predicted. The entire Chernobyl complex would have been vaporized. The remaining 3 reactors would have been destroyed. The radioactive cloud would have blanketed Europe, but the water was gone. Instead of hitting water, the corium hit empty concrete. It spread across the floor of the basement, cooling and solidifying as it went. It formed strange, otherworldly shapes, frozen waves of radioactive lava that would later fascinate and terrify scientists in equal measure. There was no explosion. The crisis was averted. Europe was saved. But the cost was enormous. The 3 divers weren't the only ones who sacrificed their health and lives. Hundreds of thousands of people were involved in the Chernobyl cleanup operation. They were called liquidators, a grim Soviet term that made them sound like expendable assets rather than human beings. These liquidators did everything from clearing radioactive debris to entombing the reactor in concrete. They worked in conditions that would be illegal anywhere else in the world. Many received radiation doses that would impact their health for the rest of their lives. Official Soviet records claim about 600,000 people served as liquidators. The actual number is probably higher. And while the immediate catastrophe, the thermal explosion, was prevented, Chernobyl still became the worst nuclear disaster in history. The exposed reactor core burned for weeks, releasing radioactive material into the atmosphere. The Soviet government evacuated over 350,000 people from the surrounding areas. An exclusion zone of 2,600 square kilometers was established and remains in place today, nearly 40 years later. The city of Pripyat, once home to nearly 50,000 people, was abandoned. Today it's a ghost town, frozen in time. Apartments with furniture still in place. Schools with textbooks still on desks. An amusement park that was supposed to open on May 1st, 1986, that never saw a single visitor. The radiation spread far beyond Ukraine. Radioactive clouds drifted across Europe, contaminating farmland in Belarus, Poland, Sweden, and even parts of Western Europe. The full extent of the health impact is still debated today. Some estimates suggest that the disaster will eventually cause thousands of cancer deaths over the following decades. Others put the number much higher. But here's the crucial point. As bad as Chernobyl was, it could have been orders of magnitude worse. If that thermal explosion had occurred, we wouldn't be talking about thousands of deaths. We'd be talking about millions. We wouldn't be talking about a 2,600 square kilometer exclusion zone. We'd be talking about half of Europe being uninhabitable. Kiev, a city of 2.5 million people, would have been evacuated permanently. The Dnieper River, which supplies water to much of Ukraine, would have been so contaminated that vast agricultural regions would have become wastelands. The economic impact alone would have been catastrophic. The political fallout might have accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union even faster than it actually happened. And the psychological impact, the knowledge that human technology had rendered enormous sections of a continent uninhabitable, would have been devastating. None of this happened because 3 men swam into radioactive water and turned 2 valves. When you really think about it, it's almost absurd. The fate of millions of people, the habitability of half a continent, came down to 2 valves in a flooded basement, and 3 men who were willing to turn them. The story of Alexei Ananenko, Valeri Bezpalov, and Boris Baranov is complicated. For decades, they were mythologized as tragic heroes who sacrificed their lives. And in a sense, they did sacrifice their lives. They volunteered for what everyone believed was a suicide mission. The fact that they survived doesn't diminish their courage. But the myth also overshadowed them as real people. In the decades after Chernobyl, while the world told dramatic stories about the suicide squad, the actual men lived quiet lives. They weren't interested in being heroes. They didn't seek publicity or recognition. Alexei Ananenko continued working in the nuclear industry. In interviews, he downplayed what he did. He said he was just doing his job. That's the most Soviet answer imaginable, and possibly the most honest. Valeri Bezpalov similarly avoided the spotlight. He didn't want to be remembered as a tragic figure who died for the greater good. He wanted to be remembered as an engineer who solved a problem. Boris Baranov's later life is less documented, but by all accounts, he too just went back to normal life as much as possible. These weren't men seeking glory. They were professionals who, when faced with an impossible situation, did what needed to be done. There's something almost frustrating about their modesty. In the West, we want our heroes to be dramatic. We want speeches and medals and recognition. We want them to acknowledge their own heroism. But these men didn't see themselves that way. They saw a problem. They had the skills to solve it. They solved it. End of story. It's a very Eastern European attitude. And in some ways, it's more impressive than any Hollywood heroics. The real tragedy is that for years, the world believed they had died shortly after the mission. Documentaries presented their story as a sacrifice play. Memorials were built to honor their deaths. But they were alive. It wasn't until relatively recently that journalists started tracking them down and discovering the truth. And even then, the men didn't seem particularly interested in correcting the record. What does that say about heroism? What does it say about sacrifice? Maybe true heroism isn't about dying dramatically. Maybe it's about being willing to die if necessary, doing what needs to be done, and then just going back to your life if you're lucky enough to survive. Today, the Chernobyl disaster is remembered primarily for the initial explosion and the long-term health effects. The HBO miniseries Chernobyl brought renewed attention to the disaster in 2019, but even that show focused more on the political aftermath and the firefighters than on the three divers. Their story is still relatively unknown outside of nuclear engineering circles and disaster history enthusiasts. But it shouldn't be, because what they did was prevent one of the worst disasters in human history. They prevented a catastrophe that would have made the initial Chernobyl explosion look minor by comparison. They are the reason millions of people are alive today. They are the reason Ukraine still exists as a habitable country. They are the reason half of Europe isn't a radioactive wasteland. And they did it by swimming into radioactive water and turning two valves. No dramatic speeches, no heroic last words. Just three engineers doing an impossible job under impossible circumstances. In 2018, the Ukrainian government finally gave official recognition to the liquidators, including Alexei, Valeri, and Boris. They were awarded medals and honors. Better late than never. But you get the sense that the men themselves didn't care much about the medals. They had already received the only reward that mattered. They survived. They got to go home. They got to see their families again. They got to live. And because of them, so did millions of others. 3 men, 2 valves, 1 impossible mission. Alexei Ananenko, Valeri Bezpalov, and Boris Baranov volunteered for what everyone believed was a suicide mission. They swam into radioactive water in the basement of a destroyed nuclear reactor. They opened the valves that prevented a thermal explosion 300 times more powerful than Hiroshima. And against all odds, they survived. They saved Europe, and most people don't even know their names. But now you do.